Spaghetti dinner.
Yeah.
We're going to get started. Welcome, I think, to week 6 or so. Is that right?
Yes.
Week 6 of our apologetics. Let me go through a few thank yous. First off, to Annette and Gary for last week's goodies. We appreciate it. And this week, we have Nancy and Michelle. Where are they? They're hiding somewhere back there in the back. Yay! Lots of good stuff. So make sure at any time you get your goodies. We have another announcement. We have a class luncheon planned for March 10th. If you've been to these, we've held it at, where have we held it before, Gary?
Cocina del Charo.
Okay. Cena? Cocina. I always forget the name of the place. Cocina del Charo. This time, we don't know where we're going because we don't know the numbers. So we have sign-ups in the back, Gary. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, make sure you sign up in the back. And we'd love to have you join us. It's always a great chance to get away from the class and just socialize and eat some good food together. So that's Saturday, March 10th at 11:30. We have a couple resources, or a few resources. There's some world magazines, if you would like, back there. And you have to fight over this one. There's only one copy of it. But this is a David Reed book, answering Jehovah's Witnesses verse by verse. This was really a powerful tool for me early on as I got opportunities to share with Jehovah's Witnesses. And so if you are really interested in talking with Jehovah's Witnesses, this is a great book. And then the second book, there's other books over there, but the second book I'm going to highlight is this one called There Is No God by Anthony Flew. And you see the word no crossed out, and it says a God. There is a God. And this was a atheist philosopher, top-notch, who looked at the evidence from science and came to the conclusion that there had to be a God. He wrote book after book. He debated William Lane Craig, hardcore, top-notch atheist, had to give up his atheism because the evidence was overwhelming. And so that's his story right there. And the other resources there, in fact, I'll pick these up as I'm going back, and we'll put them by the food, and you are welcome to take those resources. Tonight, we're going to just do a little follow-up on Jehovah's Witnesses by bringing Alan up, who's always behind the soundboard and puts up the videos. We really appreciate him, but he has a background. He'll tell you his parents were Jehovah's Witnesses. And so wanted him to come up here and give a little insight into the organization.
With witnesses, there's dedicated publishers and undedicated publishers. I'm what you would call an undedicated publisher because I didn't go through the baptism and become a part of the organization. So technically, I'm not a Jehovah's Witness. But if you listen to what the words say, Jehovah's possessive witness, well, we all are. We're witnessing for God in Christ. They just appropriated the name. So growing up, I remember being about 5 years old, and my mother found the witnesses. So on Tuesday nights, we were going to book study. And there was a little, like a shop, 1950s type storefronts that they had their Kingdom Hall in. Next door to a bar. I remember the bar because of the bright lights. This is in the early 50s. One of the guys that was in that congregation had refused military service. They believe that they are members of God's kingdom. So to join another military to them is sort of treasonous. You don't do that. They aren't pacifists. They will fight. They will defend themselves. They hunt. They have guns. But they won't join another military organization. Now, the interesting thing is that's... Go ahead.
What if they're drafted? I mean, draft went out in 73, but prior to 73...
I was drafted.
You were drafted?
I was drafted. So what happens is that as long as they give you a choice, you refuse, but you also will not join the military under any circumstances. So I was one of the first cases where the judges were trying to figure out what to do with all these Jehovah's Witnesses that they were throwing into federal prison for 2 to 3 years and filling up the prisons with people that weren't criminals. So my parents hired the judge's brother to defend me. They contacted the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society and said, he will do whatever you tell him to do except go into the military and carry weapons. So they said, we sentence you to 3 years, University of Kansas Medical Center. So I got to be a janitor for 2 years at the University of Kansas Medical Center. One of the interesting things is that because most of the witnesses didn't understand, I had a really hard time. People were putting me down because I didn't go to prison. I did something wrong. So anyway, as I'm growing up in the storefront, this gentleman had been beat for his refusal for military service. He was crippled up. I mean, he was pretty stove up, getting around with a cane and all this sort of stuff. And the witnesses were preaching about how they would be persecuted in God's name. So in doing this, somewhere along in there, I had a dream about my mother taking us to this government office that was kind of like a Mexican house with the rooms all around and the desk. And she was searching, trying to find the right place to take us to get killed. I never trusted my mom after that. So when they were talking to me about the religion and their beliefs, I was a skeptic. So listening to science, physics in school, which I was very interested in, the 6,000-year-old Earth that they believed in wasn't working for me. And they couldn't explain it. So my parents couldn't give me the answers I needed. So I'm even more skeptical. One Tuesday night at a Bible study, book study, they're talking about evolution, creation. And they're talking about God keeping the animals as they are. Cats will be cats, dogs will be dogs. Oh, and if you ever find a half cat, half dog, destroy it. And don't tell anybody about it. Excuse me, you just told me that can't happen. So my parents didn't have the science background I needed to answer my questions as a kid growing up. The other part of it is they crossed grace and the law. They believe in Jesus Christ and grace, and he died for our sins, but if you don't adhere to the law, you're in trouble. You're not going to make it. Well, I'm sitting here watching all the brothers and sisters in the congregation. They aren't living up to all the stuff they say they are. I mean, I'm with the teenagers. I know what we're doing. I know what we're getting away with. I'm looking at it going, well, if I have to do all this, I'm never going to make it. So more and more, I was drifting out of that. And when I got drafted and sent up to Kansas City to serve at the medical center, that was pretty much the end of my association with witnesses. It was primarily they could not answer my questions. And we see that with parents and kids in all places. So the witnesses have that problem. The evangelicals have that problem. All the religions have that problem. If they can't answer the questions the kids have, they drop away. So it's like when I look at my testimony, I look back, I see the places where I think that God did something like the dream that ended up pulling me out of that faith. So anything that's pulling the witnesses out of the faith gets them to a point where they have to start thinking. And in their training, it's cult-like. If you don't believe what the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society says, they will excommunicate you. So the excommunication is not, we don't have a concept of it. If you left this church or asked to leave this church for any reason, it wouldn't be that big a deal. You have the rest of your family, you have your friends, you have all the people that you know, but the witnesses immediately start in as you begin to join them, peeling your worldly friends off. And soon you're left with only other witnesses to associate with. So if they excommunicate you, all of a sudden you are alone. It's a huge psychological impact. So when you're witnessing to them, it's like witnessing to a Muslim. If a Muslim needs a faith, they're going to try and kill him. Witnesses aren't quite that bad, but almost. So for you, it's important to realize that you're looking at someone that is risking their world if they give in to what you're telling them. So the idea that Peter's got, where you've got to be gentle and respectful, has a lot of impact with the witnesses. You don't want to be in that place where you trip their defenses and you get them scared and they walk off. And that's what they've been trying to do. So on Monday night, you spend time preparing for Tuesday night's book study. On Wednesday night, you prepare to go to their Thursday night meeting, where they're teaching you essentially public speaking and sort of an apologetics. They're teaching you how to overcome objections. But they start you out with 3-minute, 5-minute, 10-minute, 20-minute lectures that you give. So you get to stand up in front of 100, 150 people and practice. And when you're done, one of the guys stands up and he has a sheet with all the public speaking things that he grades you on. So I'm waving my hand around because they're pushing gestures. They're pushing eye contact. They're teaching you how to reach the audience, keep them entertained, keep them pulled in, convey your message. The most important thing I learned from all that is the better you know your material, the better you present. So I would, for 2 weeks before my gold lectures, be drilling and practicing and going through it and going through it. When I got up there, I knew more about the subject than I believed anybody in the audience did. So you come across with confidence. Tremendous amount of training. So after your Thursday night meeting, you kind of got Friday night off. Saturday morning, you go into Kingdom Hall. You have a short period where they brush you up on what they're going to be talking about going door to door Saturday morning, and then you're off to your territory to start knocking on doors. Same thing Sunday morning. Somewhere in there, you study the Watchtower, because Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening, they're going to meet, and they're going to go through so many paragraphs of the Watchtower article. If you open up a Watchtower, you look in it, the bottom of the page are questions. So like in our worship service, we have that little sheet where we're filling in the blanks, and they have questions that they're answering. And they talk and they discuss those and they go back and forth. Then they do the hour sermon, and that's what the general public is invited to if they're inviting somebody. So you get this huge amount of training that you're going through. Walter Martin says that you can take a 4-year seminary student, let a 90-day wonder from the witnesses get hold of him. He'll tie him in doctrinal knots. And it's pretty true. We are studying here. We understand the weak spots in their faith. Like Dan was asking, well, if it's that easy to get to them, why are they still witnesses type thing? It's because they have their whole life at risk. You can't give them enough rational, logical arguments to change that core inside them. They're armored against that. So it's like you have to find your way around it. He attacks one of the places that we've talked about, the Trinity. His thing is a little tougher, a little harder than what we're trying to do. He basically just says, if I can show you where your Bible shows 3 places, shows 3 people that are called God, will you believe in the Trinity? And then he just walks them through it step by step. So it's an interesting video. It's on YouTube. The audio on it is horrible, but it is understandable. And it's kind of the outline that I use if I'm talking to a witness. So, any questions?
What do you think the internet, the age we live in today, do you think the internet will help or hurt that faith and those followers and even the evangelicals and so on as well?
It does both. I spend time on Facebook. There's an Acts 17 Apologetics on Facebook. And I watch a lot of what goes on there. We have a lot of Christians and evangelicals that have no idea what they're talking about. Some of them, I think, are from Westboro Baptist. I mean, they are making fun of Muslims, witnesses, ridiculing them, all the things that we're not supposed to do. That gets those people exposed to us. You know, you can respond to them, you can say something to them. So there's the opportunity there to correct, but there's also the opportunity there for them to do a lot of damage.
What made you change your mind?
My parents couldn't answer the questions that I had. And the way they described God and the way things were going to come down, I knew I'd never be able to live up to his standards. And my mom, again and again, said she loved God and she loved Jesus. She couldn't explain to me why, and I couldn't get that. I didn't get that until long after. I had a period of time as an atheist, agnostic, New Ager, and then eventually back into evangelical.
How did you come to evangelical?
It's easy for you to say. Simple. I knew that I wasn't going to be able to live up to the standards because when I was in high school, there was a cute brunette that I wanted. When I got interested in New Age religion, we were in association with a group of people, and there was a cute brunette that I really liked. I came to Emanuel faith because I was dating another cute brunette.
Chicks, it's all about chicks.
We're going to need to move on, but if you have more questions, Alan will be here to answer them from an insider's view. So save up your questions and talk to Alan afterwards. And let's give Alan a nice round of applause. So, thank you. Let me pray and we'll bring Gary up here. Father, we just thank you for the truth that Alan was exposed to the truth and bent his knee to Jesus for the forgiveness of his sins, and that this other religious belief, Jehovah's Witnesses, did not provide the answers. And he saw the holes in the idea that you could work your way to heaven, and we just praise you for that. And we just pray for Gary tonight. May he glorify you in all that he does and equip us to understand the importance of knowing where the creeds are in the writings of Paul. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Alan, can we cut one of the lights so it's... Thank you, Steve. Hey, I wanted to start with something that Sharon found today on Facebook. Super Bowl MVP. What's he holding up? Cold case Christianity. He's got a big smile on his face. Isn't that a wonderful sight? That just warms my heart. I mean, I hate for us to put sports heroes on a pinnacle. I think that's kind of crazy just because you can throw a ball. But other people put him on a pinnacle. So I'm glad it's a Christian. And he's going to get a lot of time over this next year to be out all sorts of places. I mean, who knows how many different speaking opportunities he's going to have. And good for him, and God bless him, and I hope it doesn't go to his head. And I'd love to be the pastor and talk about tithing and have him be in the congregation. I'd start on sermon 1 to be the tithing. Isn't that great? That's really terrific to see. Big smile. Well, we're going to talk tonight about something that I kind of recently discovered this. I say recently, maybe the last couple of years. And I didn't know anything about this ahead of time. And the more I read about it, the more I thought about it, I thought this is just amazing stuff. And so I want to share it with you. And maybe you've heard about it before. I'll try to give you kind of a once over here, but there's certainly a lot more that you can do than we're going to do tonight. But it's odd. We're going to be talking about Paul's letters as a way to find out what early Christians believed. So why do we have to even worry about that? Well, have you heard of the Jesus Seminar? They've kind of withered and gone their own way, but in the 80s and the 90s, they were a big deal. And they put a book out, they put a lot of books out. Every time it was Christmas or it was Easter, the major media would rush to the Jesus Seminar. People would say, so tell us about the real Jesus. And these were extremely on the left scholars, and some of them had not even written really anything worthwhile when it came to New Testament studies. But they were looked at, they got the press behind them. And so people would run off to these individuals and say, well, tell us about the real Jesus. And then you see the Newsweek headlines, you know, real Jesus revealed around Christmas time. Well, the Jesus Seminar, one of the co-founders is a man named John Dominic Crossan. And I just want to share with you some of the things that he said that is trying to shake our belief in what early Christians really believed. He denied the deity of Jesus. In fact, he said that it was just all a bunch of myth-making as far as what we know about Jesus. It was created, he says, as part of what he called wishful thinking of the early church. So if you can picture this, that the Christian church is going now and the disciples are long dead, and you've got this organization that's starting to gel and set in place, and they're looking back saying, well, we've got this itinerant preacher as our guy. Do you really want to build an entire edifice around this? Let's make him a little more elevated. And so that's their story, that the early Christians treated Jesus like another guy, but then the church comes along, gets a little power, and turns him into something far greater, and all of a sudden he's got a halo, and he can walk on water, but that's a later creation. So they don't want you to believe in anything in the Gospels about the stories of Jesus. That's all just a later invention. Well, then along comes one of the top 10, as far as I've read, top 10 books as far as sales go, ever. Huge. I mean, it may be, you know, ancient history to you now, but it just lit a fire everywhere. Everybody was talking about the Da Vinci Code. And frankly, a lot of people walked away from the faith. They said, oh, I didn't know that. At the beginning of the Da Vinci Code, if you've ever flipped through it, it says the documents and the organizations are real. So then you're just kind of left to think that all he's done is make up the characters and told the real story. Kind of like you did with the World War II novel. You know, there was a real Hitler and there was a real Churchill, but you maybe make up a character to go through the fighting or something like that. Well, that's what it said on the outside. And then one of the characters says this inside the story. This is the go-to guy that's supposed to know the most about early Christianity. And this is a quote. At this gathering, he's talking about the Council of Nicaea, and that's 300 years after Jesus. Many aspects of Christianity were debated and voted upon, and of course the divinity of Jesus. You catch that? They voted on the divinity. How many do you think he's God? How many don't think he's God? Until that moment in history, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal, a mortal prophet, just a nice guy. Jesus' establishment as the Son of God was officially proposed and voted on by the Council of Nicaea. And the same guy goes on to say it was a close vote. So, you know, good thing he made it. And so he became elevated to God 300 years after the time of Jesus. By the way, you can access the Council of Nicaea to see how far off Dan Brown is. They've got the records of this council. You can go online and look it up and see what they talk about. It's utter nonsense. By the way, Dan Brown claims that the art and all this kind of stuff is accurate. He got his Bible wrong, he got his art wrong, he got his history wrong. Other than that, he was just spot on. But I mean, but people bought into it, and it sold like crazy. And then they made movies, and it went on and on and on. Well, let me tell you a third person chipping away at Christianity, at least the early stories of Christianity. Anybody recognize this person here? Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is the current boogeyman for Christians that aren't too sure of their faith. This guy has become, he's just a professor back, he's a professor back east, and he puts books out that enter the bestseller list. I'm sure other professors are going, how did he do it? His books end up on the bestseller list because of what he says. Now, he's a professor of New Testament studies. So he has a book Do you see where we're going with this thing already? Misquoting Jesus? So apparently we don't have the right words of Jesus in the Bible. This is the story behind who changed the Bible and why. He's got another book, How Jesus Became God. It was a process. Do you hear that in the title? It was a process. It took hundreds of years, but eventually he becomes God. The exaltation of a Jewish preacher from Galilee is the subtext of that one. And then he's got this one. I'm sorry, it doesn't, that really is that faint a cover. I was trying to make sure it showed up. It's Jesus Before the Gospels. How the earliest Christians remembered, changed, and invented their stories of the Savior. So these are, he's got more books out, but these books just, boom, they go right on the bestseller list, and you can see why. Because they stir people up, and they go against the flow, and they kick the shins of Christians. And so Bart Ehrman is probably the leading guy right now. I see him everywhere. They have these cruises that you can go on. He'll be on the cruise, and he'll be the guy that will discuss New Testament stuff on the cruise. There's a learning company that you get DVDs and CDs and things like that. All these courses, and guess who gets to teach all the New Testament courses via these CDs? Bart Ehrman. And so he's big deal everywhere. So what does Ehrman say? Well, here's a quote from him. This is that book, How Jesus Became God. Just part of what he had to say. The burial and discovery of an empty tomb were what? Tales. Oh, so this is like Little Red Riding Hood. That later Christians invented to persuade others that the resurrection indeed happened. So here we go again. It's the same story, isn't it? Just coming from a fresh source, a different source. As the Jesus seminar fades away, we get new people coming along, and now Bart Ehrman is the lead guy. Later, Christians come up with tales. Once upon a time. Oh, good, we're going to hear a story. And this is a story about a guy, and he's really a neat guy. We're going to make him into a God. So this is what's going on out there. This is what we're faced with as Christians. Well, what's been the traditional Christian response? Well, you know it as well as I do. People grab their Bibles, they say, yeah, but we got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we can show you what the early Christians said. But I'm trying to do this as kind of a visualization of the problem, and you can probably see it. If we put Jesus at 30 AD, and some people say 33, it doesn't really matter. It may push everything over at 3 years, but let's use a nice round number, 30 AD. The Gospels, now I'm not buying into this, by the way. I'll tell you why in just a second, but a lot of the secular groups, you go to Wikipedia, you go to Bart Ehrman, people like that, they're going to put the Gospels out here. And it's not in the order that you think in the New Testament. Most scholars, just about every scholar thinks Mark was first. Seems to be a little more primitive, and it's short. And anyway, so they'll give you Mark maybe in 70 AD. They'll grudgingly give you the others within the first century, but boy, they load them way at the end of the century, don't they? Almost to the end of the century. So you look at that huge space that you got there. Now, I want to tell you, first of all, we'll get back to them. I want to make tonight kind of the skeptic's perspective, that we can still have great faith giving them these dates. So we're going to give them these dates just for tonight. I don't buy into the dates. And so this is my interjection here, and I'm sure you're going to be with me on this as well. We ought to be suspicious of this late dating for the Gospels. There's plenty of reason to be suspicious. And I'm going to give you 2 or 3, but I would like you to think about it first. I bet some of you have heard things like this before. Why can we, I think with great confidence, move those Gospels much closer to the time of Jesus? Anybody know why? You have some thoughts on that? Rick? 70 AD. Yeah, well, if your Messiah says something is going to happen, and it happens, and you know about it, you're going to put it in your works. And the Gospels don't say it. Just Jesus says someday the temple is coming down, the stones are coming down. And people go, what, you're crazy? And it is. Well, if it comes down in 70 AD, the temple comes down, you would put it in there. It's not there. Tracy, what were you going to say?
That was what I was going to mention. Something else I had on the tip of my tongue, but I can't remember at the moment.
Yeah. So there it is, the destruction of the temple. The temple, according to the New Testament, is still standing. All through the New Testament. Nobody ever says anything about the temple being down. Do you think that was a big deal to the Jews? Oh, it's 9/11 multiplied over and over and over. I mean, if you ever read the story of Josephus when he wrote about the war with the Romans, Good heavens, it's something like the Romans, choked off Jerusalem and they starved the people until the estimates are something like 1 million people probably died, and people are eating other people. I mean, it's just awful. And finally the Romans broke through and knocked everything down. It was horrible, and we can't even begin to think about it. It's got to be in the Gospels that happened, and it's not in the Gospels. Here's another one. You don't have to be a Christian. You can go to the skeptics. They will agree that probably right around 65 or 66 AD, both Peter and Paul were put to death. They don't push them out any further than that. Well, let me ask you something. Let's take the book of Acts for just a second. At the end of the book of Acts, are Peter and Paul dead? They're still alive. Now, you say, well, maybe they just don't want to talk about their martyrdom. Really? Who gets about a chapter and a half earlier in Acts as a martyr? Stephen. So if the writer of Acts thinks that's important to have Stephen's martyrdom, and no offense to Stephen fans here, but he wasn't a heavy hitter when it comes to the early Christian church, wouldn't you think if this is written before 65 AD, you'd put something in there about the death of the major missionary and the major person next to Jesus, Peter? But they're not mentioned as dying. They seem fully alive and kicking at the end of Acts. And Acts, after all, is later than Luke, the same author. And Luke's not the first of the Gospels. So I think all of a sudden you're starting to march this thing backwards a little bit. How about one more thing, and we won't spend time on this tonight, but just the eyewitness details that are in the Gospels. If you were writing this 80 years, 90 years later, you're not going to have the kinds of details that are in there. If the temple got destroyed, I'll just give you one example and then we'll move on, but in the Gospel of John, he says that pool that they did the healings, that there were 5 colonnades. John gets specific, said there are 5 columns there. Well, if the temple gets knocked down in 70 AD and the whole city gets trashed, anybody that's writing this much later is going to look back and say, I have no idea how many colonnades there are. The whole thing is just destroyed. But John specifically says 5 colonnades. So finally they do some work, archaeological work in the last 50 years, 75 years. Guess how many colonnades they count? 5. And that's just one thing. Luke is so good as far as the kinds of governors and names of people and authorities and how ships ran and all this kind of stuff that was only early 1st century. They've even done a study of the names that are in the Gospels compared to other places. They've looked at names. You know how names change. They kind of lose popularity. Hardly anybody's named Gary anymore, and Adolf kind of went out of style about the late 40s. That kind of went away. So the same thing happened with the early Christian church. The reporting, they got the names that they found in other kinds of documents that were early 1st century, real early 1st century. These names, the popularity changed over time. So there are a lot of reasons to believe that you can move the Gospels earlier. But I'm going to, for tonight, if that's okay, I don't want you to say I'm buying into them, I'm going to let them have those late dates. So this creates a problem, doesn't it? Remember that big gap that we had there between the time of Jesus and these Gospels? It's a 40-year gap. So let me ask you, 40 years ago, well, we're in 2018. Okay, we got our time machine, we set it back, 1978. Jim Jones ruined Kool-Aid for a long, long time, didn't he? See, if you're laughing, you remember at least a few things about Jim Jones, and it's a tragic thing, obviously, but we don't remember all the details of Jim Jones. We don't exactly remember where did he end up, why did he go there, somebody got shot down there. Yeah, I was a United States representative, House of Representative member, but do we remember the names and how many died? No, we don't remember a lot of that stuff. We say, well, forget it, it's 40 years ago. Close Encounters had just come out. Remember that one? Richard Dreyfuss sitting there taking his mashed potatoes, making. Am I the only one? Okay. But it's 40 years ago. You think, oh man, that's a long time ago. Dreyfuss looked good. Jimmy Carter was president. Okay, we'll forget it. We won't go there. But by the way, he's the longest living president after his presidency. So, he's done some good things. So, I think more of the good things after he was president. All right, don't forget that. Happy Days was the #1 show. Yeah, the Fonz. Hey. Okay. Mr. Cool. The Minimum Wage. Read that, huh? $2.65 an hour. Yeah, I remember when I finally got up to $1.75 an hour, I thought I was really living high. So this is 40 years ago, because you can see the problem. People are going, man, 40 years between the time of Jesus and the first writing of the gospel. A lot of stuff that happens. Your life gets busy. You start forgetting things. Well, here's the neat thing, and this is what I want to focus on tonight, is looking at not the Gospels, but looking at the letters of Paul as a way to figure out what went on in the early church. So we're going to actually end up leapfrogging the Gospels and get back even earlier. So real quickly, because I know you know all of this stuff, I'll just run through some of the things about Paul here. Saul was the Jewish name. He was a Roman citizen. Remember a few times he got grabbed and mishandled by people, and he'd say, why are you doing this to me? I'm a Roman citizen. And they stepped back really fast because you don't mess with Romans. And so when he was put to death, he was probably beheaded. He wasn't crucified because he was a Roman. He was taught by Gamaliel, a really well-known rabbi. And the only reason I mention that is Paul had no reason to leave the faith. He's not going to gain anything by becoming a Christian. In fact, he's giving up everything. Remember, he said, it's all done. It's all just refuse in my book. And you think, really? He was going to be one of the top. He would have been the cream of the Jewish society at this time. He had it made the rest of his life. He was a sharp guy, and he'd been taught the best, and he would have been respected in his society, and he just gave it all up. He said, it's not worth anything. And he gave it up for shipwrecks and stonings and beatings and all this stuff, and eventually his death. Persecuted early Christians, as you know, converted after an appearance with Jesus. And he made some missionary trips I just want to touch on for a second. And the author of some letters in the New Testament, we'll take a look at that in just a second. Then about 65, maybe 66 AD, put to death in Rome. So the only reason I'm mentioning this is I want to show you something. His first trip was just in this area, and then he came back. And you recognize that today to be Turkey. You got Greece over here, and then you got Rome, like the boot there. So what happens after his first trip? He gets this vision of a man from Macedon. Remember that story? And the man says, come on over. And you say, well, okay, so he went on over. Well, here's the deal that makes it really important. If you can imagine this being kind of a dividing line, this would have been considered Asia. It was kind of like the minor leagues at the time. And here's where your civilization was, this way, because you got the Roman influence all through here. Of course, you got the Greeks. They're known for all their great learning and all. So when Paul takes that leap, and it really was a leap, to go from Turkey, the area of Turkey, when he takes that leap and goes across, he's moving into a big area that's where the church catches fire, because you've got more sophistication, you've got more money behind you, and you've got better transportation, I mean, just all this kind of stuff. So Paul moves there, and there you get Corinthians and places like that where he ministers. And then let's talk about this. Again, I want to let the skeptics have their say for tonight. We look at our Bible, and we open it up, and we go, look at all these letters of Paul. Well, I put asterisks because there are some letters that are contested. Not us, not Emanuel faith, but again, we're talking about the skeptics. They'll say, well, we're not so sure about Ephesians, we're not so sure about the Timothy letters, we're not sure about Colossians. Okay, for tonight again, I'm going to give them those. We're only going to look at the asterisks. Okay, so they can have the other letters. I'm especially going to look in Corinthians. Nobody doubts that Paul wrote Corinthians, so we're all on the same footing there. Inside these letters, and this is what we're going to look at tonight, are creeds and hymns. So, what is a creed? It's a formalized, easy to remember statement of faith. Remember, this is a society that doesn't have a lot of writing material. And so when you gather people and they say, I think I want to become a Christian, it makes sense, my neighbor explained it to me, you want to give them something, a little nugget that they can go out and hang on to, and it's going to be something that they can memorize. So today we have these mission statements that companies put out. I just picked one just for the heck of it, Bristol Myers. Here's what they say: to discover, develop, and deliver innovative medicines that help patients prevail over serious diseases. Is there anything in that? It's just a single sentence. Is there anything in that makes it a little easier to memorize?
The D's.
Yeah, you hear the D's? That's not an accident. Somebody sat there and thought about it and said, okay, we need something that's going to catch. That's called alliteration. Peter Piper picked the pickled peppers. So they're doing the same kind of thing. 3 D's there. And then I think the other one, the double P, to help patients prevail. I don't think that was an accident either. But, if you work for this company, I bet within a couple days you'd know this. They probably have it all over the place. So that's a creed. And in Paul's letters, I want to run you through just some, and then I want to focus on one so that you can see that they're all over the place. And in some cases, you probably didn't recognize it. A lot of Bibles don't indicate, this is an early creed. You just read it. But 1 Corinthians 11:23, for I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. We often hear pastors mention that at the time of communion. Here's another one, Philippians. Now, I had to squash it down, but this is one of my favorite passages. Do you love it? It's in Philippians 2, and if you look at your text, it should show it like a poem, because it is. It was an early song. And I always thought, man, if I just had a time machine, I'd set that dial back. I'd go wander into Philippi somewhere and see if those people were sitting there on a Sunday morning and listen. I wonder what it sounded like. What would the tunes be around? Were there any instruments that anybody had there at that time? No. But it was a song. It was an early song of the church. So I just picked a little bit of it, and it's powerful if you can read that sometime on your own. Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature of God, humbled himself and became obedient to death. How about some more? Colossians. He's the image of the invisible God, for by him all things were created. 1 Timothy 3. He appeared in a body, was vindicated by the Spirit, was seen by angels, was preached among the nations. For some reason, that one really sounds like it's got a rhythm to it, doesn't it? I think it's because of the was, the way it's set up that way. 2 Timothy 2. Remember Jesus Christ, raised from the dead, descended from David. Again, you hear that kind of balanced statement, raised from the dead, descended from David. Romans 10:9, if you confess Jesus as Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. So people are starting to study the passages inside of these letters of Paul, and it's kind of like you're digging through a mind that's been opened up, and you're pulling stuff out. And a lot of it is it's okay, but all of a sudden you come across a nugget of something, and you go, wow, this is the gem that we've been looking for. So something like this is going on. People are now spending time as critics and authorities of old language studies and all, and they look at this stuff and they go, this is not Paul. This is a creed that the early church has. And I'll explain how they're coming up with that in a couple of minutes. But these are some of them, and there are probably still others out there that people are going to come across someday and say, yeah, that's another example of a creed or a hymn. So what's the summary of this? They're really, really early. Again, I'll explain why in a couple of minutes. They're easy to remember. You saw some of those. Many of those you've memorized. You're doing better than I am. I always have to cheat and look at this. It's getting worse as I get older. I don't remember as well as I used to. It's really helpful in a verbal society where a believer can give somebody just this one sentence or this short hymn. I bet you know some songs, don't you, that just stick in your head. Songs are pretty easy to remember. Old rock and roll songs or whatever, they're there. So what we're going to do is, did I go past them? No, I got it. Okay. Here's what I'd like to do just for a couple of minutes. You saw my timeline before, but I've got a couple new points on here. So see if this makes sense. So we got Jesus in 30, same time period. Most critics agree within 2 years Paul had been converted. He's on that road, remember? And bammo, he gets hit with the light and all. So 32 AD probably is his conversion time. Now, we can't be real specific, but most critics will agree with that. What does Paul do? Does he immediately start preaching? No. He goes out in the desert, and he's just communing with God, and apparently God's showing him some of the things he'll go through, all the suffering and all. But he spends 3 years. Now, he says this. I'll show you where a little bit later, but he says all of this stuff. So in 35, after he's been out in the desert for a while, he comes back, and he talks about it. It's in Galatians. He comes back to the church in Jerusalem, and he talks to the people there. And then he says, it's again in Galatians, he says 14 years later, so now we can jump it up to 49 AD, he goes back, now he's been preaching all this time, he goes back and he double checks with the authorities in Jerusalem, and I'll read some of that to you in just a second. In 51 AD, he now goes to the city of Corinth and starts preaching there. Now he hasn't written the letter yet, he's just live preaching to these people. A few years go by, 55 AD, he's starting to hear things about the church. He's moved on somewhere else, and now he's hearing things that are not all good. And he goes, oh my goodness, I better write a letter to these people. So he writes his letters to the people of Corinth. And now we got the Gospels out here. Can you already begin to see where we're going with this thing? I mean, what's starting to happen as we move from these out here to these here? Are we getting further or closer to the time of Jesus? We're getting closer. I haven't proved anything yet, but I mean, at least the time period for Paul, by definition, even though our Bibles don't put it that way, I don't know, maybe it was just me. When I was a kid, I always thought the New Testament was all chronological. You know, because Revelation is at the end, and everybody kind of agrees that was probably the last book written. So I figured, well, it's got to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Acts was later. That must, and then they throw Paul stuff, you know, after Acts, and you think, okay, it must be later. No, it's not. All of his stuff's earlier. He's dead. At least according to some of these skeptics, he's dead before any of the Gospels are written. Okay, so does this make sense as far as just this chronology up here? All right. So how do we get the timeline? I'm just going to abbreviate it, but it's all Galatians. Remember, the critics are giving us Galatians. They're saying it's Paul. Okay, Galatians 1. He says after 3 years, remember he was probably 32 AD, was converted. 35, he says after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Peter and James. Okay, I just want to read something to you there. Give you a little more information about that. So I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Peter and stayed with him 15 days. And he says, I saw James as well. He had 2 weeks on the day. Do you think he did more than talk about the sports? 15 days with the guy that hung out with Jesus. Do you think he absorbed a lot of information? Do you think he learned about the faith? Do you think he learned about the life of Jesus? Oh yeah, from somebody that was right there. And James, why would James be important? The brother. And frankly, a non-believer probably during Jesus' ministry, because remember, he's the one with the family that's trying to pull Jesus away and saying he's nuts. Sorry about that, folks. So he apparently was, you know, converted later. And then look at, so that takes us up to that 35 AD. Now, why does he go back in 49 AD? Because he says 14 years later, I went up again to Jerusalem. So give me a second, and let me pick up on that. So he says, 14 years later, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I went in response to a revelation. I did this privately, he said, to see if I had won my race in vain. So do you hear what's going on? He's gone out and he's preached this message, and he's gotten such opposition, and he's kind of a loner, you know. He's not with all the church people. He's out doing these lonely vigils, and he's beginning to say, I hope I got the right message. I better go back and renew the ties with the roots of the faith. And so he goes back to Jerusalem. And he says this time it's James and Peter, same two, but who's he picking up for a new source? John. Is that a good source? Yeah. John's part of the inner circle. So he's got the big three there. And then what I didn't have a chance to put up there, just kind of ran out of room. He says he met with these people. He says these men, these three men, added nothing to my message. Is that good news? Yeah. So what he's hearing as he goes back is, oh, that's what I'm preaching. So there's no disconnect between, is he drifting away from the faith? Absolutely not. So everything that you meet in those Gospels and everything you meet in the letters of Paul, jive. They go together really well. And then in 1 Corinthians 15, this is where I want to go in just a minute. He says, now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached you. This is now 55 AD, and he's talking about when he was with them in 51. He says, remember what I said to you? Okay, so what did he say to them? Well, this is it. And this is the only one I really want to focus on tonight. And remember, there are other creeds here, but this is the one, a real go-to creed. Just mark this one for sure someplace. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and they appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. So just that part right there is a creed, and I want to show you why and what's going on. Did you notice it started off by him saying, what I received, I am passing on to you. That was rabbinical talk. It was not new with Paul. And what Paul is saying there is, I'm not making this up. I got handed this, and I'm passing it along to you. And so passed on means a tradition, in this case a creed. I want to pass this along to you. So again, I hope this is not too confusing, but you got Jesus in 30. You've got eyewitnesses who watched what went on. Remember Paul's talking about him. He said there's 500 of them. And those eyewitnesses then create these creeds really, really early. Paul comes along. Remember, he's in Jerusalem. By 35 AD, he's in Jerusalem. And he's picking up these creeds. He's hearing these creeds. And then he goes to the church, in this case, the Corinthian church, and says, I want to share these creeds with you. So that's the sequence or the cycle of what's going on here. So how, of course, the question would be, well, how early is this creed? Is it the 50s and the 40s? What are we talking about here? Well, remember, Paul was in Jerusalem at 35. He went off in the desert for a few years and came back, and he goes to Jerusalem. And again, the critics will give us the 35 AD thing. That's when he got the creed. Well, the creed's got to be older than that. There are phrases, and again, I don't know this stuff. I'm just going by what the critics say and people that understand language and all. There are some extremely odd ways that Paul is putting this together. Well, why is it odd? Because it's not Paul writing it. This is a creed that's written by somebody else, and it doesn't sound like the rest of Paul. It's not the same vocabulary. It's not Paul's wording. So this is definitely something that he's importing and passing along to the people there. Even things like calling Peter Cephas. That was a real early Aramaic way to talk about him. That was not Paul's wording. He's using that phrase coming from this creed. And now, what do the scholars say? Well, I'm just picking two of them here. One says all the elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. 2 years. And then an Orthodox Jewish scholar, somebody that doesn't have a Christian influence going here, not trying to do something with Christianity. This formula of faith may be considered as a statement of what? Eyewitnesses. People that actually saw the events that Paul referred to. He said, you can go talk to them. That's a great challenge, by the way, isn't it? To say there's 500 of them. You want to go talk to them? They're there. So here's the timeline one more time. That creed is probably around, well, some people, I've even heard some people date it to the fall of the year that Jesus was crucified. That just gives me goosebumps. And I'll tell you why in just a second. You probably figured it out as well. But anyway, the creed is really, really early. Paul goes to Jerusalem, picks it up, takes it with him, tells the people eventually about it in Corinthians. Now, is that better news in a way than out here? Yeah. So why is this important? Now we know what the early Christians were teaching each other, these creeds. That was the basic way they were communicating about the life and death of Jesus. These are eyewitness accounts. These are not, as we heard from Herman and these others, these are not hundreds of years later people saying, gosh, there must be some way we can elevate this guy into something big. These are eyewitnesses that are reporting this. It's supported by key early Christians, Peter and Paul and James and all these heavy hitters here. Yeah. Sure.
I just wanted to say something about the eyewitness.
Yeah.
And that is, I don't think the importance of that can be overstated because so many things were claimed in other faiths that could not be corroborated, like the night journey of Muhammad, or things like that, or the golden plates of Joseph Smith. Here is Paul is essentially daring his critics almost, saying, if you don't believe me, there are nearly 500 people that you could go ask and see, did you see Jesus resurrected? Einstein had said, there isn't a single fact that can prove my ideas are right, but it's possible for one single fact to prove me wrong. Mm-hmm. And here Paul is saying, there are hundreds of people out there. Any one of them, if I'm lying, will say, no, Jesus is still in his grave. It's a challenge that is absolutely unmatched in any faith all over the world.
Well, take the Mormons. Now, they say there were what? Steve can help me. How many witnesses said they saw the place? But every one of them either got booted out of the church or they left the church. So they're over. I mean, they don't have anybody left. Was it 4 or 5 of those?
Mike is going up.
Oh.
Yeah, there's a number of witnesses, but there were 3 primary witnesses. And if you read the account of what happened when they supposedly saw the plates, Joseph Smith had them in a bag, said they're in here, and they had to pray about it. They had to pray over these so-called plates that were in a bag that they didn't see, but they had to pray that they would see it. And so their testimony changed, that they saw it through the eyes of faith.
Mm.
And so they never really saw the plates. Why do you have to pray over seeing a artifact? That's suspicious right off the bat, that all 3 of them prayed. Those were the 3 primary. The other ones, some of them even recanted that they never saw the plates.
Yeah.
But just to be a little bit of a skeptic on that point, I've always wondered about this 500. There's just like you're saying, it's very daring for Paul to write that there were 500 available, but now you've got stories about the 3, but nobody's got any stories about any of the 500 or anything like that, right? It's just a challenge that's put out there, but it's not like you have any writings from any of the 500 or anything like that, right?
No, what's interesting to me is that Paul is saying the eyewitnesses are there in Jerusalem, and the church starts in Jerusalem. I mean, if I'm going to make up a faith, I'm going to go over to Bombay or someplace. I'm going to say, I've raised dead people in Escondido. And they go, well, I don't know. Okay, I'll follow you. You got a glib tongue. But if I start right here in Escondido and I go to door and I say, you must join my church, and people say, why? Because I can raise people from the dead. I've done it right here. So you start asking around, you've never seen that guy raise anybody from the dead. Puts people to sleep, but he doesn't raise them from the dead. Right? So to me, that's a huge proof that something weird went on.
The fact that the church grew.
Yeah, it grew from the spot where the claim is stated that Jesus came back from the dead. It seems like it's really easy to disprove it. You go find the body, or you find witnesses that say, no, don't count me as a witness, I wasn't there. It's too early, by the way, for any mythology to creep in. They've done all sorts of studies. How long does it take myth to come into something like Alexander the Great's story or Homer's stories and things like that? There's not enough time. It takes like 2 generations before myth begins to creep into a story. And so you can't say, well, this is a mythological story like some of the Jesus Seminar ideas. And here's the good news. It's the same message, isn't it, as the Gospels have. And it does all sorts of damage to any other possibility. These early creeds say Jesus really was resurrected from the dead. Well, people for years have tried to come up with, well, what's an alternative to that? Well, they're flying in the face of eyewitness reports. You get things like the spoon theory. Jesus just passed out on the cross, came to in the tomb, it was cool, and he got out and went back to his disciples, and they said, you're the Son of God. Does that make any sense? And most people have given up on that theory. That doesn't make any sense at all. What about the stolen body? You heard that one? The disciples went in, somebody went in real quietly and took the body. Any problems with that one? Yeah, the Roman soldiers are there. Yeah, are you going to die for the fact that you stole a body and someday they're getting a cross ready for you? You're going to say, time out, I was kidding. Look.
Yeah.
Why are you going to go to your death and give up your life and just, none of the disciples recanted. And you stole the body? How long does a little click last when they're trying to do something? Like think about Watergate. How long did that last? The conspiracies don't last all that long. People start singing like birds. The women went to the wrong tomb. You heard that one? No. Women went to the wrong tomb. All you have to do is go dig the body out and say, you went to the wrong tomb. Here he is. That theory doesn't work. How about hallucinations? I think right now that's the one that people are kind of landing on, that don't want to buy into these eyewitness reports. These people just wanted so desperately to see Jesus. Do you have any problems with that one?
There's no such thing as mass hallucination. There's never been a documented mass hallucination.
There's no such thing as mass hallucination. Everybody has individual hallucinations.
People are also easily talked out of hallucinations. Someone sees something, and then someone says, oh no, I don't see the same thing. And they go, oh yeah, I guess you're right.
Yeah. So, the alternate theories really don't work, and you still have, all the eyewitnesses.
There was a scene in Case for Christ where Lee Strobel, he goes up and he asks a PhD, I think, in psychology, if that was possible for hallucinations. And she said that if Jesus was able to, or if there was a psychological hallucination across that many people, that would be a greater miracle.
That's good. Be a bigger miracle. Gary Habermas, I'm taking some ideas from Habermas because he is the leading authority on the resurrection. If you want to find things about the resurrection and just kind of pique your interest, GaryHabermas.com. He just gives away all sorts of articles and things there. He said this: no longer can it be charged that there's no demonstrable early eyewitness testimony for the resurrection or the other most important tenets of Christianity. Of course, that just flies in the face of what Bart Ehrman told you. For this creed, and he's talking about that 1 Corinthians creed, provides just such evidential data concerning the facts of the gospel, which are the very center of the Christian faith. The death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, that's it. That's the Christian faith, and we're hearing it all the way back. It's not the Gospels alone. It's Paul and these creeds that Paul took. And so we're getting really close to the time of Jesus. And so I think we're coming up on Easter, not too far from here. This is in the same chapter. You notice that? It's 1 Corinthians 15 again. So what does Paul do? First he says, let me tell you this creed. And then what does he say? This is one of the most powerful verses, I think, in the Bible, isn't it? Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, and he's starting to make fun of death there. Death, where's your victory? Where's your sting? You don't have it. So Paul goes to his death, not worrying. Peter goes to his death, not worrying. The disciples go to their death, not worrying. And because Easter is coming, and the good news is out there. So that's our hope. The Gospels are out there. As far as the skeptics want to put them, they can't get away from these early creeds that are way earlier than that, and they testify to the same thing. Jesus died, was buried, and was resurrected. That's the good news. So do you want to do some Q&A here? Okay. Maybe Alan wants to. Do you have questions for Alan too?
We can do
I want to add something to the resurrection, the hallucination. Another problem with the hallucination is that you have two enemies who didn't have good thoughts about Jesus. In fact, Paul wanted to kill Christians, and yet he said he saw the resurrected Christ. So it couldn't have been a hallucination. Not enemies don't have wishful thinking, and the same thing with his brother James. James was a skeptic. And James then says he saw Jesus. So you have two enemies that were not wishful thinking to come up with a hallucination. So that's more proof against this false idea of a hallucination. So questions about anything?
For Alan, it seems like it was a blessing for you to go to the medical center and work there. Only for the sole reason because earlier you said that you become isolated. The JWs, they make you become more isolated, and then you lose all your friends. And then just the fact that you went to work at that hospital gave you the chance to meet other people, or else you would have been stranded like a lot of others. It sounds like a lot of others that they lost all their friends and anything they had.
That's very accurate.
So, blessings to you. You're blessed.
There's a lot that I talk about when people manage to get me to talk about my testimony and getting converted. For Emanuel faith, one of the biggest things, as cute as the brunette was Dennis talking about the Trinity. And he starts reading scriptures from Hebrews. I'm going, I don't remember that. No, that's not what that says. So I'm getting open a Bible, not the New World Translation, but one of the study Bibles that I acquired. And yeah, that's what it said. And I went back and looked at the JW Bible. Oh, that's not what they say.
Yes, Bob.
To my understanding, and I have heard this before, but when the scripture refers to a number such as the 5,000 or the 500 witnesses, it actually refers to men only. That was, to my understanding. And so if it was women and children, it could be up over 1,000.
Yeah, I've heard similar things, especially when it says Peter preached that first at Pentecost. He preaches, I think it was 3,000 men come to know Christ, but that didn't count the women and children that also came to know Christ. And so the church actually was bigger than the numbers indicate early on.
And there again, that's that first message is right in the city that people saw Jesus dragging that cross, being crucified. You think people have said, we saw him, he never came back. But the church grew right there, right in the heart of the story where it took place.
Were people who died in Nero's crosses, that were burned alive in Nero's crosses, were they probably eyewitnesses back then?
Well, let's see, that was the Nero's like in the mid-60s. A lot of people think that's why Peter was put to death as part of the Neronian persecution. Yeah, they could have been. I don't know if they were accused of that, and just probably accused of being Christian. I don't know if they were eyewitnesses.
What Dan's referring to is that Nero, during his festivals, would put Christians on stakes and use them, light them up, and then use them as lamps for the festival and things like that. Very cruel, obviously a cruel ruler. Similar to some that we have in other countries.
Well, wasn't Nero in Rome and the witnesses in Jerusalem?
Well, they would drag people off to be put on trial. Irenaeus, was he one of them? He was an early church father, and he was taken from his church all the way to Rome to be put on trial. I don't know if he had to be important enough to be, taken off that way. But
yeah, Paul was taken to Rome.
Well, the early church scattered too, right? It scattered after persecutions.
Yeah.
All over.
You mentioned that the material we went over with the previous class about that proves by verses that there is a Trinity and things like that, that you can't give enough of that proof to a Jehovah's Witness because, like you said, of the penalty of giving up the faith. So how do you get around that to reach Jehovah's Witnesses because of that belief that they don't want to hear the facts because they'll be disenfranchised by their family and friends? I mean, sounds kind of hopeless.
It is and it isn't. Like Steve says, it's a matter of not scaring them away. Gentle respect. And you keep going. The Spirit's going to do the rest of it. So we can't really break down their defenses. That's something they have to be willing to take down. So we give them the information, we give it to them in whatever form they can take it, as gently as we can. And one of the things, I had gone back to school and got my master's in psychology, applied psychology. Psychologists don't tell people to straighten them out. They guide their thinking. So when we start asking questions, what do you mean by that? Why do you think that? What's your evidence for that? It forces them to think. Now, the thinking is already behind their defensive wall. They've got to answer those questions. So that's how we get in.
Like Coco's book says.
Yes.
There is an elder who was an ex-Mormon, David. I always get David's last name messed up. Starts with an M. McKenneth or something of that nature. That's close?
Yeah.
How do you say it?
I'm sorry.
Oh, no one else wants to help me.
I too have the problem.
But David comes to know Jesus inside the Mormon faith. And his wife left him and took the kids. His whole family was destroyed, but he wasn't going back because Jesus is everything. And so he's now remarried and has another family. But the cost is extremely high.
Well, going back to the question about eyewitnesses in Rome, realize that the Jewish population at that time was dispersed because I would imagine the Christians, how they were discriminated against in Jerusalem itself, that many of them left because of the discrimination by the Jews. If we actually look at the whole history of the Jewish dispersion, in 200 BC, the city that had the most Jews was Alexandria, Egypt. That's where the Septuagint translation came through. And they actually had a temple service in Alexandria that was bigger than anything they had in Israel at the time. The only thing they did is that the priests in the temple in Jerusalem had to have their lineage back on the line of Levi in order to be priests, or not be priests, priests at the temple in Alexandria. But the Jewish people were very much dispersed throughout that whole time frame, and I just imagine that, particularly with the persecution of the church there in Jerusalem, that may have caused a lot of Jews to leave, and so it's very possible there were many eyewitnesses there who were in Rome.
Yeah, there's also in Acts chapter 8, Stephen gets stoned in Acts 7, and then at the beginning of Acts chapter 8, it says that persecution broke out, and the disciples who started in Jerusalem, because Jesus said, you are to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the world, they get scattered in Acts chapter 8, and so you could just understand that they were all over spreading the good news of the gospel.
Two things I want to encourage you guys with. In the last 7 years, Bob and I were out on the streets. I probably had 2 people bring up the issue of the late Gospels or the stories or anything. So it's not like if you guys are out witnessing to whoever, your friends, your family members, the neighbors, whatever, you're probably not going to see this a lot. But the guy that came across this about 4 weeks ago at Oceanside, he sort of came on with this, but everybody has a tendency to exaggerate, right? So it wasn't the late Gospels. He was pushing the New Testament letters to like 300. And so I had a very eloquent and scholarly response to him. I said, "You're wrong." I said, "There's no proof for that. You're absolutely wrong. I don't know where you're getting your information from." And he let it go. He didn't push on it anymore. So, you just tell them, because they got no evidence to back it up, and then you start telling the gospel. You're wrong, but let me tell you why I think you're being arrogant about this, because you don't want to bow your knee to Jesus Christ. Because he's gonna, one day when you die, be real to you. And so you start getting into the gospel. You kind of use this stuff as a, something in the back of your mind to make you realize that what you're saying is true. And this builds my faith up to be more confident when you're dealing with people. Another Jehovah's Witness came up my front door, and I live in the boondocks, all right? They used to come when I was over at Boyle Avenue over here, but when I went out there, I was surprised they showed up. So they showed up, and they started giving me this stuff, and I used to be pretty nice to them. But I told the lady that came up, she had 3 kids in the car. And I said, "Ma'am," I said, "I want to tell you something. 10 years ago, you guys came to my front door, 20 years ago, whatever it was. And I said, I was interested to know what you guys thought. And so you gave me the book, Is the Trinity Real? Gave me the little thing. And I said, I went down to the local Escondido library, and I looked up the quotes that you put in your little magazine, and you guys are taking them completely out of context. And I don't know who wrote this thing, and I don't know who gave you the information and told you it was true, but it ain't true. And I looked it up. So if you're going to be honest to your kids over there and be responsible, which is what you are supposed to be as a parent, then you ought to be teaching them the truth. And I'm going to tell you, you do your own research on this, because these guys are lying to you. I don't know if it affected her or not, but it was, it was real. And when you put their kids in the mode of what their hopefully most valuable possession is, and that they're lying to their kids, hopefully that does something to their ego or their responsibility as a parent, I would think.
That was a great tie-in to being a parent. I thought that was an outstanding tactic. The booklet was called Should You Believe in the Trinity? And I was handed, I've got multiple copies of it, I was handed that, and the research that Keith is talking about is now on the internet. It's all over the internet. And that's why they pulled that booklet back. It's hard to find now because it's been shredded because of all the partial quotes, using ellipses and pulling out anything that damages their position are just yanked out. And so I reinserted them, and I have taken Jehovah's Witnesses and say, what do you say about this? You've taken whole passages and you take it out of context. And he looked at me and said, well, you do the same. Are you I had to say, well, let's not focus on me, let's focus on you. Is it right or is it wrong to do this? And he said, oh, it's not wrong. And that's what he had to come up with, was there was nothing wrong for them to take things out of context in his mind.
Hey, by the way, I just want to thank you. A lot of you got back to us. I sent a note out this week because Steve and I are going to be talking to the elders of the church and another meeting, which is the pastors of the church. And they've never met with us to find out what we're doing as an apologetics class, because they got 1,001 things going on here. So it's our chance to finally say, this is what we're trying to accomplish. And we thought, well, why not let you speak? And so we've been typing up, it'll be anonymous, but I've been typing up, some of the comments that you've given us. I thank you for that, and thank you that the class has meant something to you. It's been really insightful to read your comments. So just pray that it'll go well in front of the elder board and in front of the pastors, that they'll just understand what we're trying to accomplish here. And it's been a joy for Steve and I to be doing this. So thank you very much for that. Let's go ahead and close, and you can stick around if you have any other questions, and probably still have some good things over there. Father, I thank you for this evening. I thank you for the class and the interest that people are showing by coming out, and they're 101 of the things we could be doing. And I thank you for the impact that you have in this class, and I pray that we carry it beyond the walls, that we go out and we interact with people. And like Alan was talking about, making sure that we interact with love and concern and grace. And so I just pray that you bless us as we go about the rest of the activities of the week, and pray in your Son's name. Amen.
Let's take it.